A forced smile tastes like ash, a bitter contrast to the lingering, coppery tang of old pennies in the mouth. Sitting in a chamber thick with the stench of ozone and alien arrogance, Ambassador Roland Hayes allowed the galaxy's most ruthless empire to spit on his species. He simply kept smiling, knowing it was the easiest way to conceal a knife. The air in the orbital spire was too thin, spiked with a metallic tang that coated the back of Roland's throat. It smelled like bleach mixed with something sweet and rotting the natural pheromones of the Kaldorian elite. Roland adjusted his collar. The starched cotton bit into the loose skin of his neck. He was 62 years old. His knees hurt when it rained on Earth, and right now his lower back was throbbing a dull, persistent rhythm. The chair they had provided him lacked lumbar support. It was also built 4 inches too high, forcing his polished leather shoes to barely graze the slick obsidian floor. It was a calculated architectural slight. Everything in the room was. "They're doing this on purpose," Claire muttered. She was sitting to his left, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Claire was young, sharp, and currently vibrating with a barely suppressed rage. Roland could hear the faint, grating sound of her molars grinding together. "I know," Roland said. His voice was a low rasp, barely carrying over the high-pitched, irritating hum of the station's environmental scrubbers. "Stop grinding your teeth, Claire. You'll need them later." "It's been 5 hours, Roland. Then we will wait 6. He didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the massive blast doors at the far end of the stark, blindingly white room. The fluorescent lights overhead were harsh, casting no shadows, leaving nowhere to hide. His eyes watered slightly from the glare, but he didn't blink. He kept his face entirely neutral, a mask carefully constructed over decades of civil service. Roland wasn't a hero. He had never fired a weapon in anger. He didn't have the jawline for propaganda posters. He was a bureaucrat, a man who spent his life analyzing margins, logistics, and the quiet, ugly compromises that kept human colonies from being glassed from orbit. The heavy lock mechanisms on the blast doors finally engaged, a heavy clunk followed by the hiss of depressurization. 3 figures walked in. The Kaldorians didn't walk so much as they occupied space, pushing the air out of their way. At the center was General Hector. The translation matrix in Roland's ear had assigned the alien a Western name, an approximation of his guttural, multi-tonal title. Hector stood 7 feet tall, clad in a ceremonial armor that looked like dark, polished beetle plating. He smelled intensely of sulfur and raw spice. Hector didn't apologize for the delay. He didn't even acknowledge Roland's presence until he had seated himself at the massive curved desk opposite them, his heavy, 3-fingered hands resting on the surface. "Ambassador Hayes," Hector said. The translation collar vibrated against Roland's throat, turning the alien's clicking syllables into flat, accented English. "You look tired. Does the gravity of our station compress your fragile spine?" Claire shifted, her chair squeaking sharply against the floor. Roland reached under the table and rested a hand briefly on her knee, a silent command to freeze. Roland smiled. It wasn't a small, polite smile. It was wide, showing teeth, stretching the skin across his cheekbones until it pulled taut. It felt entirely unnatural, a physical exertion that made his facial muscles ache. "General Hector," Roland said, his tone warm, dripping with manufactured deference. "The gravity is bracing. It reminds us of the strength of the Kaldorian hegemony. We are just grateful for the audience." Hector stared at him. The alien's eyes were completely black, devoid of sclera, reflecting the harsh overhead lights like polished stones. He sneered, the mandibles framing his jaw flaring outward in a gesture of unmistakable disgust. "Gratitude is the currency of the weak," Hector rumbled. "I have reviewed your species' counter-proposal regarding the Outer Rim territories." Hector didn't touch a datapad. He simply flicked his wrist, and a holographic projection of the human frontier colonies flared to life between them. Glowing red lines systematically crossed out human settlements. "It is rejected," Hector stated. "We will not share the mining rights in the Cordis sector. We will take them." Your colonists will be given 30 planetary rotations to evacuate, leaving all infrastructure intact. Failure to comply will result in pest control. Claire's breath hitched. That was 3 billion people. 3 billion people living on worlds with heavy atmospheric processors, orbital tethers, and generations of sweat poured into the soil. Evacuating them in a month was logistically impossible. It was a death sentence, framed as an administrative deadline. Roland felt a drop of cold sweat detach from his armpit and slide down his ribs, soaking into his undershirt. His stomach twisted, a hard knot of acid and bile welling up in his throat. He swallowed it down. The metallic taste of the room seemed to concentrate on his tongue. He kept the smile plastered on his face. "That is a very aggressive timetable, General," Roland said softly. "Our civilian transports are slow. We might struggle to meet your expectations without some logistical leeway." "Your struggles are not a Caldorian concern," Hector replied, leaning forward, the sulfur smell rolling across the table in a nauseating wave. "You came here to sign a treaty of compliance, Ambassador, not to negotiate. You are a species of dirt scratchers who stumbled out of your atmosphere a millennium too late. Do you truly believe you have a choice?" Under the table, Roland's right hand slipped into his trouser pocket. His thumb traced the cold, smooth metal casing of his secure data link. It was a small, heavy piece of tech, no larger than a coin. "No," Roland said, letting a note of pathetic resignation enter his voice. He widened his eyes, dropping his shoulders, making himself look smaller, older, broken. "No, General, we understand our place. We are fully prepared to comply with your parameters." Hector's mandibles clicked together in a rapid, staccato rhythm. Caldorian laughter. "Excellent," Hector said. "Then we shall dine, and you will sign the transfer over a meal, as is our custom. Come, humans, let us celebrate your surrender." The banquet hall was worse than the meeting room. One entire wall was a transparent viewport, looking out into the void of space, and filling that void was the Caldorian First Fleet. Roland stood near the glass, staring out. It was a staggering display of military excess. 400 dreadnoughts hung in the blackness, their hulls jagged and aggressive, bristling with kinetic bombardment cannons and plasma lances. The blue glow of their idling fusion drives cast long, eerie shadows across the banquet hall. It was a fleet designed to intimidate, to conquer, to break the spirit of anyone who looked at it. "It's a graveyard out there," Claire whispered, coming up beside him. She wasn't talking about the ships. She was talking about what those ships would do to Earth. Her voice was shaking now, not with rage, but with the creeping, icy dread of reality. "Look closely, Claire," Roland murmured, keeping his voice so low the station's passive audio sensors wouldn't pick it up. "Look at the formation. Look at the tethering lines." Claire frowned, squinting through the thick, transparent steel glass. The dreadnoughts weren't just holding position. They were physically linked to the station and to each other by thick, glowing umbilicals, massive data, and power conduits. "They're synchronized," Claire noted, confused, sharing the station's ambient reactor power to save their own fuel reserves while they wait. "Arrogance," Roland said softly. "They are so convinced of their absolute superiority, they tether their entire command structure into a single, centralized network to save a fraction of a percent on fusion fuel. It's efficient, and it's incredibly stupid." "Ambassador." Hector's voice boomed across the hall. Roland turned, seamlessly plastering the grotesque, subservient smile back onto his face. The dining table was a long slab of raw, uncut obsidian. The Caldorian officers were already seated, tearing into their meals. The air in the room was thick, humid, and smelled violently of iron and raw meat. Roland took his seat. The plate in front of him contained a gray, gelatinous paste. Beside him, Hector was using a sharp implement to carve slices off a bloody, unrecognizable carcass that still seemed to twitch on his silver platter. "Eat," Hector commanded. gesturing with a bloody knife toward Roland's plate. It is a synthetic nutrient composite. We synthesized it based on scans of your agricultural waste. It should sustain your frail biology. It was a direct, calculated insult, feeding the human envoy trash while they feasted. Roland looked at the gray sludge. His stomach roiled. He hadn't eaten in 14 hours. He picked up the utensil, provided a dull, spoon-like instrument, scooped up a portion of the cold paste, and put it in his mouth. It tasted like wet chalk mixed with bitter plastic. The texture was grainy, catching in the back of his throat. He forced himself to chew, forced himself to swallow, smiling the whole time. "Fascinating texture, General," Roland said, dabbing his mouth with a stiff napkin. "Very efficient." Hector barked another laugh, ripping a piece of meat from his plate with his teeth. "You humans are infinitely malleable, like clay. You take whatever shape the strong mold you into. Tell me, Hayes, does it bother you, signing away billions of your kind just to save your own capital world?" "Survival requires compromise, General," Roland said, taking another bite of the paste. He forced it down, fighting his own gag reflex. "We are pragmatists." "Cowards, you mean?" Another Caldorian officer spat from down the table. "Perhaps," Roland agreed amicably. His thumb was back in his pocket, resting on the metal coin. He pressed a tiny indentation on the surface. Once, twice, a pause, 3 times. A localized, heavily encrypted pulse fired from his pocket, entirely invisible to the station's sensors, carrying less energy than a static shock. "Your fleet is magnificent, General," Roland said, gesturing toward the viewport with his spoon. "I have never seen such coordination. Are they fully integrated with this station's systems?" Hector puffed out his chest, the beetle armor expanding. "Of course. The Caldorian network is absolute. From this room, I monitor every reactor cycle, every weapons array, every life support module on all 400 vessels. We act as one mind. It is a level of unity your fractured, chaotic species could never comprehend." "Indeed," Roland said. The smile was beginning to hurt his jaw, a sharp cramp forming near his ear. He massaged it away, looking down at the table. He felt a deep, profound self-loathing bubbling up inside him. He hated the taste of the paste. He hated the smell of the room. He hated the way he was nodding, agreeing, playing the beaten dog. He hated that he was good at it. But most of all, he hated that it was necessary. "Bring the datapad," Hector ordered. An aide scuttled forward, placing a heavy, glowing tablet on the table between them. "The transfer protocols for the Cordis sector. You will authenticate it with your biometric signature, Hayes. And then you will watch my fleet depart to enforce it." Roland reached out, his hand trembling slightly. It wasn't an act. The adrenaline was finally hitting his bloodstream, making his fingertips cold, making the lights in the room seem suddenly sharper, more aggressive. He looked at the tablet. The text was in standard diplomatic binary, outlining the complete forfeiture of human territory, the dismantling of defensive platforms, the surrender of billions to the dark. "General," Roland said, his voice dropping slightly, "before I sign, a point of curiosity." Hector sighed, clearly bored. "Make it quick, human. You said your fleet is tethered to the station's network, sharing power, sharing data, all 400 ships." "Yes. And the network relies on the station's central firewall to filter external anomalies?" Hector's eyes narrowed. The chewing stopped. "The Caldorian firewall is impenetrable. Why do you ask mundane structural questions?" Roland's smile didn't drop, but it changed. The subservience vanished, replaced by something cold, tight, and profoundly tired. The mask didn't slip. It hardened. "Because, General," Roland said, staring directly into the pitch-black eyes of the alien commander, "humanity doesn't just scratch in the dirt. We also dig. And sometimes we bury things." Under the table, Roland's thumb pressed the metal coin one final time, holding it down. "What are you?" Hector started. rising from his chair, a sudden primal alarm breaking through his arrogance. Roland didn't look at the datapad. He looked at the viewport. In the absolute silence of the void outside, 40 miles away, a section of empty space seemed to ripple. It wasn't a ship decloaking. It was a payload that had been sitting there for 3 months, cold, dark, and utterly silent, waiting for a signal. A specialized drone, smaller than a garbage scow, built with one single suicidal purpose. "Claire," Roland said evenly, calmly wiping his mouth with the napkin. "Close your eyes." Space does not carry sound, but the thick, transparent steel of the viewport vibrated violently against Roland's palms. The stealth drone outside didn't explode. It unpacked. Like a mechanical insect shedding its carapace, the cold metal shell fractured, revealing a densely packed array of tight-beam microwave transmitters. They were aimed squarely at the central communication array of the orbital spire. For 3 seconds, absolutely nothing visible happened. There was no flash, no cinematic laser beam, no smoke, but inside the banquet hall, the air changed. The low, irritating hum of the station's environmental scrubbers suddenly hitched, squealed like a dying animal, and fell dead silent. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered, dimmed to a sickly yellow, and then snapped to a blood-red emergency glow. Roland opened his eyes. The manufactured smile was gone. His face simply looked haggard now, the deep lines around his mouth sagging with the gravity of what he had just unleashed. Hector froze, a chunk of bloody meat half raised to his mandibles. The alien's pitch-black eyes darted toward the ceiling, where the station's automated voice began chanting in a rapid, overlapping loop of Kaldorian distress syllables. "What is this?" Hector barked, dropping the meat. He slammed a heavy fist onto the obsidian table. "Report! Why is the network cycling?" No aides answered. The Kaldorian officers down the table were already scrambling for their personal datapads, but the screens were either dead or strobing with frantic, meaningless geometric patterns. "General," an officer yelled, his voice cracking with sudden, uncharacteristic panic. "The central firewall. It is gone. Not breached. Deleted. Something is overriding the core heuristics." Roland slowly pulled his chair back and stood up. His lower back screamed in protest, a sharp pinch of sciatica shooting down his left leg. He ignored it. He reached over to the table and casually picked up his stiff cloth napkin, wiping the lingering taste of the gray nutrient paste from his tongue. "Humanity learned a long time ago that building bigger ships is a waste of economic resources," Roland said, his voice quiet, flat, carrying easily through the sudden silence of the paralyzed room. "You put all your faith in armor, General, in plasma lances and kinetic shields, but you forgot about the plumbing." Hector wheeled on him, his mandibles clicking in a frenzy of rage. "You? A cyber attack? You think a primitive logic loop can damage a Kaldorian dreadnought?" "A dreadnought? No," Roland replied, walking slowly toward the massive viewport. He gestured outside. "But 400 dreadnoughts? Hardwired into the exact same unfiltered power grid to save fuel? That's not a fleet, Hector. That's a domino rally." Outside the glass, the aesthetic perfection of the Kaldorian First Fleet was unraveling. The glowing blue umbilicals connecting the massive warships to the station suddenly flared with a blinding, violent, violet light. The data spike, a polymorphic, self-replicating scrap code designed by paranoid misanthropes in deep underground bunkers on Earth, was riding the station's raw power feed directly into the fleet's unshielded maintenance ports. It didn't target weapons. It didn't target life support. It was a virus designed to do one single thing: tell the magnetic containment fields of a fusion reactor that they were operating at absolute zero, forcing them to overcompensate. "Cut the tethers!" Hector roared, spit flying from his mandibles, spotting the polished floor. "Sever the network connections, now!" "Manual overrides are locked," the communications officer screamed, frantically slamming his heavy, three-fingered hands against a dead console. "The system doesn't recognize our biometric signatures anymore. It thinks." It thinks we are an invasive process. Precisely, Roland muttered. He watched the closest dreadnought. Its hull, previously dark and menacing, was beginning to glow. The metal was superheating from the inside out, turning a dull cherry red along the primary engineering decks. Then, the containment field failed. In the vacuum of space, there was no fiery mushroom cloud. There was only a blinding, instantaneous flash of pure, white-hot plasma expanding outward in a perfect sphere. The dreadnought simply ceased to exist, replaced by a miniature sun that swallowed the two ships anchored adjacent to it. The kinetic shock wave hit the station a fraction of a second later. The entire orbital spire lurched violently. Roland was thrown off his feet, his shoulders slamming hard into the obsidian floor. The impact knocked the wind out of him, leaving him gasping for air that was already growing stale. He tasted copper. He had bit his tongue. Around him, the banquet hall descended into absolute chaos. Heavy chairs overturned. Kaldorian officers, 7-foot-tall apex predators, stumbled and fell like toddlers as the station's artificial gravity grid began to stutter, fluctuating wildly between standard pressure and agonizing heaviness. Claire was already on her feet, grabbing Roland by the collar of his suit jacket and hauling him up. Her face was pale, but her eyes were cold, entirely focused. She didn't look at the carnage outside. "Are you hit?" she demanded, her voice tight. "Just old," Roland grunted, leaning heavily on her shoulder. Outside the viewport, the void was boiling. The chain reaction had caught. Ship after ship ruptured in silence, their reactors detonating, creating a terrifyingly beautiful display of overlapping plasma spheres. The thick tethering cables whipped wildly as the ships they were attached to vaporized, sending massive surges of corrupted electrical feedback straight back into the station. The smell in the banquet hall shifted abruptly from raw meat and sulfur to melting polymer, scorched electrical wiring, and the distinct, terrifying scent of ozone. Hector was still standing. The alien general was holding onto the massive obsidian table, his armor visibly trembling. He looked out at the graveyard of his own making, his black eyes wide, uncomprehending. The pride of the hegemony, decades of military buildup, enough firepower to subjugate a spiral arm, was turning into radioactive slag because of a software glitch deployed by a species he considered dirt scratchers. He turned his gaze slowly to Roland. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a primal, murderous hatred. "You," Hector hissed. He drew a heavy, brutal-looking sidearm from his hip. The weapon hummed with lethal energy. "You sign your own death warrant. Hayes. Even if you destroy the fleet, you die here. With me." Roland stood up straighter, forcing his aching spine to align. He looked down the barrel of the alien weapon, feeling the frantic pounding of his own heart against his ribs. He was terrified. Every biological instinct screamed at him to run, to cower, to beg. He didn't. He dug deep into that well of bitter, cynical professionalism and found one last, genuine smile. It was a tired, ugly thing. "I told you, General," Roland said, his voice raspy but steady. "We are pragmatists. I never planned to leave this room alive, but I did plan on leaving it empty." Before Hector could pull the trigger, the scrap code reached the station's localized defense grid. The automated internal security turrets, mounted seamlessly in the ceiling corners of the banquet hall, deployed with a sharp mechanical snap. The virus had rewritten their friend or foe recognition protocols. It didn't recognize humans as friendly. It simply recognized anyone carrying Kaldorian High Command clearance codes as a critical threat to be neutralized. 4 heavy plasma bolts crossed the room in a blinding instant. Hector didn't even have time to scream. The general's chest plate shattered under the concentrated fire, the kinetic force throwing his massive body backward over the obsidian table. The remaining Kaldorian officers broke into a blind panic, diving for cover that didn't exist as the turrets swiveled, systematically tracking the command signatures embedded in their armor. "Down!" Roland yelled, dragging Claire behind the solid mass of an overturned serving cart. The air above them superheated as plasma fire filled the room, the smell of burning flesh mixed with the scorched electronics, creating a stench so thick it coated the back of Roland's throat in grease. He kept his head down, his hands pressed hard over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut as the deafening cracks of the turrets echoed off the walls. It lasted less than 30 seconds. When the turrets finally clicked empty, retreating back into the ceiling housings, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Roland waited a full 10 seconds before he moved. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been filled with lead. He slowly peered over the edge of the serving cart. The banquet hall was a slaughterhouse. Not a single Kaldorian was moving. He let out a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline rapidly leaving his system and leaving behind a cold, shivering exhaustion. He sat back on his heels, leaning his head against the metal cart. "Claire," he rasped. "You okay?" "Yes," she whispered. She was trembling now, staring at the body of a Kaldorian officer slumped just a few feet away. "Yes, I'm okay." Roland pushed himself up, his knees cracking loudly in the quiet room. He walked over to the obsidian table. The datapad Hector had demanded he sign was still sitting there, completely dead, its screen cracked from the shockwaves. Roland looked down at General Hector. The alien's dark blood was pooling on the pristine floor, mixing with the spilled gray nutrient paste. There was no triumph in Roland's chest. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a garbageman who had just finished a particularly long, disgusting shift. He had murdered hundreds of thousands of sentient beings today. He had done it with a smile on his face, using a cowardly weapon, stabbing them in the back while they ate. It was a stain on his soul that no amount of rationalization would ever wash out. But as he looked out the viewport at the swirling debris field of the obliterated fleet, he thought of the 3 billion colonists in the Cordis sector. They would wake up tomorrow, go to work, breathe the air, and never know how close they came to the dark. It was a trade he would make again. "Come on, Claire," Roland said quietly, adjusting his collar, trying to smooth out the wrinkles in his suit. "The station's life support is bleeding out. The extraction shuttle should be breaking stealth in Sector 4. We have a long walk to the docking bay." Claire stood up, stepping carefully around the bodies. She looked at Roland, really looked at him, this tired, aching old man who had just dismantled an empire over dinner. "They're going to call you a hero back home," she said, her voice hollow. Roland snorted, a brief, bitter sound. He limped toward the blast doors, his polished leather shoes leaving faint, dark footprints on the white floor. "Only if we survive the walk, kid," Roland muttered, not looking back. "Only if we survive the walk." If you love this deep dive into humanity's dark, pragmatic edge, hit that like button to feed the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another HFY Sci-Fi original. Have a favorite moment? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Share this video with a fellow sci-fi fan. And until next time, keep looking at the stars. Humanity might just surprise you.